아주 권익하게 예, 근주민 남발에
So first of all, to all of the members of the Sangha in the monasteries and nunneries, everyone in the Dharma centers, and all of our Dharma friends around the world, I'd like to begin by offering you my greetings. So today is the 8th day of our teachings. So what we are discussing today is the age of philosophy. Now, as I introduced the other day, during the later Vedic period, if we divide it, there are 3 different sections. And the first part of these is the 4 Vedas, the third is the Brahmanical period, and the third is the age of philosophy. So we're speaking about this in terms of the 3 parts. So today what we're speaking about is the age of philosophy. Now, when we talk about this age of philosophy, the situation was that the Aryan peoples had already extended outward from the Ganges, out from Punjab to the Ganges River Valley, and then they began to extend outward, take more area around from the Ganges River Valley. So it covered a larger area. Now, whether we think about politics or literature, the traces left by this time are among the greatest in the history of Indian civilization. They really stand out. If we speak about this in terms of politics, there is the region of Magadha. From the beginning of the Brahmanical area, from the time of the end of the area when the Brahmana texts were appearing, the region of Magadha was a region that everyone knew about. And so when we came to the age of philosophy, then the region of Magadha was a place where advances were occurring at an even more rapid pace. So if you take a look at this map, I think you can probably understand. So this is the Ganges River Valley here, right? And so they moved into this Ganges River Valley and then became larger and larger. And so it shows this differently colored region of the map. So they eventually covered this entire area. And what this map shows is shows the 6 great kingdoms. So these are 6 great kingdoms that appeared during this era. And so Magadha is here. So Magadha was in this area, and it became very important. The reason is that, as I explained before, from the time of the Brahmanical era, everyone knew about the region of Magadha. And during the age of philosophy, then Magadha then developed even more rapidly than before. And eventually, all of northern India came under the control of this kingdom of Magadha. And so Magadha itself became a cultural and political hub. Later, when the Buddhist teachings were appeared, the main area where it was established and again got a foothold was in Magadha. Likewise, there was the Emperor Chandragupta, who was renowned as being like a Chakravarti, a universal emperor. And he also appeared in this kingdom, the kingdom of Magadha. So for these areas, if we're thinking about northern India, or you can also say that the center, of course, is basically the center. So in this central India, Magadha is a country in central India. So this is a great country of that. Now, also in South India, there was this is the area, there's the kingdom of Andhra, in the area of Andhra Pradesh. So in that region of Andhra, there was the kingdom of Andhra. And it also became another hub of politics and culture. Sometimes there are some encounters between the civilization, the culture of Andhra and the culture of Magadha. Likewise, there are also connections with the Dravidian civilizations from lands even further to the south. And so these peoples were probably the Dravidians who had been exiled from the Aryan, exiled by the Aryans. So this became a third great kingdom. In any case, at that time, there became three powerful kingdoms. And so then out of this, there developed the six great kingdoms. So gradually, individual Indian civilization was able to cover the entire geographical area of India. So first the Aryans came to the northwest of India, but the other areas, but their civilization didn't spread to the entire geographical area. But gradually, the Indian this culture was able to spread to all the geographical areas of India. So I think it's best to start to be speaking about the kingdom or dynasties of Magadha. Now, to speak about the kingdom of Magadha, this is Magadha. So in the map here, it is this more brownish color, but sometimes it was a little bit larger and sometimes smaller. So for that reason, when we talk about Magadha, it's like the most important kingdom in ancient India. And during this age, or the age of philosophy, it was not only a cultural and political hub for all of India, also became an important center of Buddhism, where Buddhism spread widely. The Bhagavan Buddha spent over half of his life in Magadha, and also the councils in Shravasti and Pataliputra were also all convened in this kingdom of Magadha. So in terms of Buddhism, Magadha is one of the most well-known lands in an important country. So Magadha is where its location is in the lower reaches. If you talk about the upper and the lower reaches of the Ganges Valley, it's in the lower reaches of the Ganges River Valley. So basically, most of the areas of eastern India were formerly regions in Magadha. But the size of the country of Magadha fluctuated greatly during the different dynasties that ruled it. And so you can't say that's not always definitely one area. There were times when it covered the entire culture, the entire area of northern India and many areas of the south. And so it's a very powerful and large country. So So it is difficult to say that its area had what exactly where its area always was. But in any case, it was a very ancient kingdom and a very important kingdom in the history of India. Now, yesterday I mentioned the Indian Purana histories, the tales of the past, you could say in English. Now, when I talk about the Purana, or the tales of the past, this is like the name of a category or a genre of Indian literature. So there are many different texts within this category. So it has quite extensive content, discusses many issues, primarily how the universe was formed, how the different types of gods appeared, how the kings appeared, and also the various religious movements and so forth. All of these are described in the Puranas. So in these Puranas have many legends and philosophy. And they describe events related to religion and so forth. Now, the Puranas that are still, there are many Puranas that are still extant. In the time when they appeared, was probably not, they date to a time not too long after the Buddha passed away. So these Puranas, as I said, mentioned the other, there are so many different types of literature I've mentioned the other day. So if we compare the Puranas to them, these are a later genre of literature, but I don't need to speak too much about them right now. Still, the Puranas are very important, And for the reasons when we're speaking about the points of the ages of philosophy, we need to use the Puranas as historical sources. So next, when I speak about the history of Magadha, I have to take what is described in the Puranas as the basis for the discussion. Now, the first dynasty in Magadha was called the Haryanka. Now, this dynasty, even before the Haryanka dynasty, it's quite likely that there was a country or a kingdom of Magadha before this dynasty. But the available historical sources do not clearly indicate that there was a country before the Haryanka. So for that reason, I'm putting the Haryanka as the first dynasty. Now, this Haryanka dynasty reigned in Magadha for over 200 years. And during these over 200 years, there were 10 kings. And so this period, so that the Buddha was born during this period, is also the time of the 16 powerful kingdoms. So this is the time when this occurred, as during this dynasty. Now, the second dynasty is called the Shaishunaga dynasty. It's called the Shaishunaga dynasty. So Shaishunaga, this Shaishunaga dynasty reigned in Magadha for 60 years, and during these 60 years, there were 2 kings. Now, of course, here about this topic, scholars have different explanations of this period. However, for the time being, we don't need to speak about that. And this was also during the time of the 16 powerful kingdoms. Now, the third era was the time of called the Nanda dynasty. The Nanda is the word, and it means like joyful. And so this dynasty reigned in Magadha for 100 years. And over these 100 years, there were 10 kings. Now, the fourth dynasty was the Chandragupta dynasty. So Chandragupta established the Maurya dynasty, which and took over and controlled Magadha. So the emperor Ashoka was actually the grandson, was probably the grandson of Chandragupta. So that is a very brief introduction to the country of Magadha. And we will speak about many different events related to this, such as the birth of the Buddha and so forth. So what I'd like to introduce next are the sutras. Now, these sutras after the Upanishads had appeared, what the Brahmanas did is they continued to preserve their ancient forms and ancient customs. Similarly, the Brahmins also continued to perform the sacrificial offerings as like their mainstay, as like a symbol of being a Brahmin. And so they considered performing these rituals and offerings very important. Likewise, all the common people also felt that performing rituals had become like a part of their life. So you do the rituals and it's part of your life. So they became a part of their way of life. And so for this reason, they continued to perform the rituals and they couldn't give them up. And so what the Brahmins did is that many different philosophies had developed and appeared. And these led to a lot of doubts and suspicions about the rituals conducted by the Brahmins. And so the Brahmanical understand, or the Brahmanical. And so the Brahmins wanted to preserve their rank and their status stably in society. And they also wanted to also to be able to give a traditional education to the future generations. And so what they did is that they established a stages and an education. They codified the different hierarchies and responsibilities. So they made like rules for each of the different castes. What were the Brahmas supposed to do? What were the Kshatriyas supposed to do? And so they codified all these rules. So if we talk about them these days, they became like topics of study in school, like the modern subjects we study in school. And so they made textbooks for this. And so what were these textbooks? The way these textbooks were written is that they had very, very concise words. They were mainly in verses, and they're very concise. And so this is a new genre of literature that they called sutras. So in Tibetan, they're called do. So in Sanskrit, they're called sutras. Now, when you say sutra means like a thread. It means the thread, and it's and linguistically, its root is the word siv. So it comes originally from the root siv. So it's like making, which means to sow. The sieve means to sow. So it's like the thread is like making a thread in a garden of flowers. So when when you take the original vast meaning and you condense it into a few words, you have very complicated meaning, and you condense it into just a few words that you could to explain it. So this genre of teaching that was called the sutras. Now the reason it was they were written so concisely, so that instead of having a lot of elaboration and complications, they wanted to be able to teach anything, whether the rules or the customs or so forth. They wanted to teach them in concise words that people could remember, and so they wrote these new texts that were in very short and concise words. Now, the earliest of the sutras probably appeared in the 6th century BCE. So the earliest sutras probably were completed in the 6th century BCE. And the latest appeared around the turn of the millennium, around the beginning of the Common Era. And their content was, as I included, like the content of the Brahmanas that I described yesterday, and it basically repeats the content of that. Basically, they're essentially like another iteration of the Brahmanas. Now, of course, there's a little bit of new content, but most of it is like repeating the points taught in the Brahmanas. So for that reason, there's not a whole lot of difference between them and the earlier Vedic literature. But their particular quality is that the Brahmanas are very long. They're in prose and they're very complicated, and so. But the sutras are not like that. The quality of the sutras is that they're really concise and simple. This is like the special feature of the sutras. And they're often made into verse. They weren't long like in prose. The reason why they're made into short stanzas was for children, because they are giving education to children, right? So when we mean children, we mean like children from the age of 8 or 9. It had to be something that the children could easily memorize. Memorizing prose is harder. It's difficult to memorize prose, and so they made the stanzas. Because it had been prepared in stanzas, it was made easier for people to memorize. So for at that time, people were primarily thinking of the practice. They're thinking if it's all these long things, you want something you can memorize, something that you can join to your mind. And so they were written in the form of verse. So generally, there are many different sutras. There are many different of the sutras. And there are also different types of, even with the sutras, there are many different, because it's like textbooks. There are the textbooks used in one book, in one school, the textbooks used in another school. There are many different textbooks, right? So it's similar with this. With the sutras, there are many different traditions of sutras, and even within each tradition, there are many different sutras. So one thing that is actually kind of disappointing for us is that most of these sutras have been lost. They aren't extant anymore. So for that reason, what we have now are these. So what is remaining are so only a few remain. Most of them have been lost. But in order to study the sutras, what we first need to understand, though, is what were the different types of traditions or philosophical schools that had arisen at that time. And so for that reason, so I need to give you an introduction to the different types of philosophical schools. So there were three different types of these philosophical schools. And the first section is the six branches of the Vedas. So when you talk about, so this is a philosophical school, you could say, or the tenets, or there's like a tradition of preserving. And what it primarily is in order to preserve the root Vedas. So that is how the six branches of the Vedas appeared. Now, each of these branches had its own tradition. And within each of them, there are many different sutras in each of these different areas. But only a few of these sutras remain. So to describe them in general, these are the six branches of the Vedas. And so the first is ritual, the second is reading, the third is poetics, the fourth is etymology, the fifth is grammar, and the sixth is astrology. So I will talk about these in detail later. Now, the second section are the six we call them the six sophist schools, or we call them the six philosophies. And so this time the six philosophies are among these six philosophies are ones that have become well known in Buddhist literature. And so these six soft schools, or the six philosophicals, the first one is the Samkhya, the second is the Yoga, third is Nyaya, fourth is Vaisheshika, fifth is Mimamsa, and the sixth is Vedanta. And so you could say that this is like the second tradition of sutras. Now, the third tradition of sutra is for the two religions. And what are these two? It is Jainism and Buddhism. Now, the Jain and the Buddhist religions are generally the place where they're based upon, or where their seeds are found in the philosophical texts in the Upanishads. So that seems to be like the basis for them, as it is said, as many scholars say. However, these two school religions are different than the aforementioned six philosophical schools, and the different way of thinking. They had a great advance in them. There's a lot of freedom of the way of thinking. And so these became the most complete. So they appeared after the complete development of other traditions. So for that, and whether we're speaking about the Jain tradition or the Buddhist tradition, neither of them actually accepted the Vedic traditions. They did not accept the Vedic texts. And so this is like a feature of these two. So whether we're speaking about the Jain or the Buddhist texts, the main teachings of them are the sutras. They were taught in the form of sutras and preserved in this fashion. And so they are considered the third category of sutra texts. The Jain and the Buddhist. But whether we're thinking about the but neither the Jain or the Buddhist texts appeared in written form during the Vedic period. It was only later that they had spread and were written down. During the time of the Buddha, the words of the Buddha were not written down. So the sutras of both of these religions did not appear during the Vedic period. So now, I mentioned the first type, the 6 branches of Veda as the first type of sutra. And so to give a brief introduction to them, when we talk about the 6 branches of Veda, or the 6 types of Vedic literature, the first branch is what we call ritual or kalpa. Kalpa or ritual. So it's a shiksha or perhaps kalpa. The word. So this is translated into Tibetan as ritual. Now, in this category, there are 3 different categories, or 3 different sets of sutras: the Sutra of Listening, the Sutra of Dharma, and the Sutra of Household Life, the Shrauta Sutra, the Dharma Sutra, and the Grihya Sutra. Now, the Shrauta Sutra, or the Sutra of Listening, so this Sutra of Listening is called the Shrauta Sutra. And the reason why it's called the Sutra of Listening is that it explains the rituals found in the Vedas very simply. The next is the Dharma Sutras, the Sutras of Dharma. So what these are very important texts. And the reason why they're such significant texts is that they describe the customs and habits of the time, and also the laws and legal traditions of that time. So for this reason, the Dharma Sutras have become a very important historical source. Later, there's a type, the text we call the Manusmriti that I mentioned the other day. And so the Manusmriti text was formed primarily, or many of the points of the Dharma Sutras became an integral part of the Manusmriti. So at that time in India, the way they taught these laws and traditions was that from a very young age, children were made to memorize the laws. Children had to memorize the laws, and so that when they grew old, they knew what their responsibilities, their professions were, and they recognized this based on the texts that they had memorized as children, and so they practiced according to those texts. And so the way they practiced this is by making the children memorize these legal texts from the young age. However, these days, we don't have the entire Dharma Sutras. Many parts of it have been lost, and so we only have fragments left. It is not complete. The next type is what was called the Household Sutra. This Household Sutra is called the Grihya Sutra. What it teaches is whether you're a child or generally the sons, the husbands or the father, all of them had roles that they had to fulfill and responsibilities they had to carry for their family and the members of their family. And so the Grihya Sutra describes what their responsibilities are. What are the, like for an eldest son, what are the responsibilities? What rituals do they do? What are the responsibilities of a father? And so these are described in and so they speak a lot about the ways one should get married or have children. It speaks about breastfeeding, education, and so forth. All of these are described in great detail. It also describes the many different rituals that are associated with the household, and also the different religious rituals that the leaders of a household had to perform. And each of these is described clearly in order. So this sutra, the household, or the Grihya Sutra, if we research the Grihya Sutra, what we can learn from it is how people led their lives at that time. We can understand this, learn this clearly from the sutra. So these three sutras, the listening sutra, the sutra of dharma, and sutra of household life, are all what we call here the sutras of ritual or kalpa. The general name is kalpa. Now, when we speak about the sutras of rituals, of course, in different traditions and in different regions, there are their own particular sutras now, but only a few of them remain today. Only a few fragments remain today. And the second is what we call reading. Now, what reading means here is, it's called shiksha in Sanskrit. The word shiksha means so when you're reciting the words of the Vedas, what are the pronunciations? What are the strong sounds, the soft sounds? What are the how is the pronunciation done? What are the places of origin of each of the letters, and so forth? And the reason for studying this is that for many generations, the Vedas had been preserved through memorization and recited from memory. And when you're reciting them from memory, if a single word is mistaken, then this is thought to be like an offense against the gods. So you could not mistake even a single word. If you're not allowed to get even one word wrong, then you need to understand the nature of the vowels, the strength, the weight of the letters, and also the how you had to hold your tongue. Did they come from the palate, or were they guttural, or the labial, or so forth? You had to understand all of this so that you would be able to recite them without getting even a single letter wrong. And so they had such great interest and to this that they developed this genre called the reading. Now we did have these. Now we do have some texts on this. There are many texts on how to read the mantras, but no one studies them anymore. This means like how do you say that? How do you pronounce this? There are texts in Tibetan. How do you recite the mantras? And these are very similar to these texts on the reading sutras. But if you read what's written in the text on mantras, and if you look, but no one looks to see whether the way we recite mantras now actually matches what's described in these texts on mantras. Perhaps there is possible that there are a few scholars who take interest in it, but usually no one takes any interest in this. So even within our text in Sutra, we said we have to pronounce the mantras properly. We need to pronounce it. They say it is important to pronounce them properly, and it's important that they not decline. And so there's a great interest to this earlier in the Vedic period, and so that is probably the reason why. Now, the source for the text on reciting the mantras came that they originally from the Buddhist texts originally, but And so these texts were taken out of the Buddhism. They're made into a separate tradition and became important for that reason. Now, the third branch of the Vedas is the Thunda. Are we on the third or the fourth? It's the third. I think I've got it mixed up. I think this is the third. The third is poetics. Yes. I think I got this a little mixed up. And maybe it's better to take a break now. It's best to take the break here. I've got too busy. So we will take a 30-minute break and reconvene after 30 minutes. Now, the third branch of the Vedas is called poetics. And what we mean by poetics is that there are the Vedas, the literature, the Aryanakas, and the Upanishads. These two aspects speak a lot about the topics of poetics. And later became an independent area of knowledge that was called like the tradition, the separate tradition of poetics. Now, the fourth branch of the Vedas is etymology, nirukta. This is etymology. Now, the topic of etymology is explanations of the difficult words in the Vedas. To explain them, they developed the etymology to explain these words. In particular, around 400 BCE, there was a celebrated Indian grammarian. So he was this great grammarian in India, and his name was Yaska. I think that's how it's pronounced. So he was a great grammarian, and because of his appearance, all the earlier India just couldn't compare to him. And so they lost all of their influence. And all of these texts were just entirely lost. Now, there's a text written by this scholar, this grammarian named Nirukta. He gave new explanations of the words found in the ancient texts. And so this is where this word, the etymology, or you could also talk about it as being the linguistic study of the origins of language. Now, the fifth branch of grammar is what's called Vyakarana. And in Tibetan, we call this grammar. In Tibetan, in English, it's called grammar. This is basically the basic Sanskrit texts on grammar. And it's primarily an explanation of the grammar of the Vedas. Now, at that time, there are many different texts on grammar. But later, there was a great scholar named Panini. And because of him, all of the texts written by the previous scholars ceased to be used. And so because they were no longer used, the texts themselves were lost. So this is the one who wrote the text called the Panini's Grammar. And this scholar named Panini was born in the northwest. The place where he lived was in the northwest of India. Now, the time when he lived is described differently by different scholars, but in to roughly describe it, it was sometime in between the 4th and the 3rd centuries BCE that he lived. So in modern times, there is a Indologist of it from Germany. So this name is Max Müller. It's a very long name. German names are difficult to pronounce, but his name is Friedrich Max Müller. And what he says is that people from all over the world who study grammar and linguistics, that the only two ancient texts of grammar, the only two ancient traditions on grammar come from Greece and from India. But if you compare all of them to the text by Panini, then the Greek grammatical texts are basically they're worthless. They don't show any great knowledge. So that the Panini grammar written by Gren in terms of grammar and linguistics spends a very high time. It's at an even higher level than the ancient Greek grammatical texts, the scholars say. So this formed a tradition of grammar or of linguistics that had never previously been present in the world. Also, in the last couple hundred years, the linguists or grammarians have done a lot of research and put a lot of focus on a certain area of knowledge, and that is the idea that all the different languages of the world came from a single source. So they have this hypothesis that there is a single common origin of all the languages in the world. There are many different languages in the world, but they all come from the same mother. This is their hypothesis or their idea. Now, this hypothesis, if we accept it, then we have to. This actually appeared 2,000 years ago in India. It is said that even at the time by Panini, or that there was a single source of all the Indian languages. So, and this shows that there was a very high level of linguistic and grammatical knowledge at that time. The idea that there's a single mother of all the world languages was taught at that time. In brief, at that time, there was a huge and rapid advance in Indian grammar and linguistics, and this is just amazing. This is what the various scholars say. Now, the 6th branch of the Vedas is astrology. Now, astrology is necessary for this reason. When you're doing the sacrificial offerings, you have to do them at just the right time. And so in order to know what that time is, they developed astrology. And in order to know when to do a ritual, you also know what the good dates, the auspicious dates. In order to know which dates are auspicious or not, to examine which days are auspicious or not, they developed the tradition of astrology. So next, above or earlier, I mentioned the branch of rituals. Among the 6 branches is the first of these branches. The first branch called rituals. And so this branch is made up of 3 different sutras, right? And so one of these sutras is the Dharma Sutras, right? So I thought I'd give an introduction to this Dharma Sutra. Now, when I talk about this Dharma Sutra, it is very important, as I said. Now, it primarily speaks about the ritual or the form of rituals. What are the order and what are the rules of the rituals? It also shows how to pay respects daily. And it also is like the determination of the standards for the way Dharma practitioners lead their lives. And so it establishes standards for that. It also describes the different powers and responsibilities of the different peoples in society. And it also says how to handle conflicts between these, or that people violate these, how to handle criminals. And so if you look at these, they're similar like the rule books we have in Tibetan monasteries. They're like rule books if we use contemporary terms. So basically, the Dharma Sutras is that people really consider the Vedas to be extremely important. And so taking that as the basis, all of the customs and traditions of the Aryan people of the Aryan peoples were systemized into traditions and customs. Likewise, as I mentioned yesterday, there's also the distinctions in castes, the caste system. And so in the Dharma Sutras, it is codified as a law, and so as rules and laws. So now when we speak about caste, if we have to put the tradition of caste into the law text, first, before we can put it in text, we have to clearly know the classifications of the caste. If you have to know the distinctions, otherwise you wouldn't be able to put them in the law texts. And so in order to put the classification the castes into the law books, they first had to really classify and settle the classifications of their castes. And since they needed to classify and clarify the classification of the castes, this gave great difficulties to the people who are writing the texts on the laws. And the reason is that in the actual fact, if you need to really clarify the distinction between class, it's actually extremely difficult. And so at the beginning, they were in a position where they just didn't know what to do. And the reason why this is that there were many castes that are not included within those of the 4 castes. And so where do you put them? They did not know. Now, if they wanted to make more castes, because like the basic foundation of the making the text is that there were no more than 4 castes and no fewer than 4. And so this is the preliminary basis as the foundation of it. So you couldn't make more, you couldn't make less. But if you look at the actual situation, there were many castes who were not included in these 4 castes. So they didn't know what to do. They gave them a great difficulty. And so it gave them such difficulties that what they did is they started to make explanations to different people. There's so many castes in the actual fact. There are many different castes, but in order they were, they just did it by force and forced them into the 4 castes. And so in order to explain this people, then people just sort of thought up anything they could. They kind of brainstormed and came up, looked for some reason. And then they did whatever they could. They didn't have any proper reason, but they just made up whatever they could. And the reason why they made up whatever they thought of, and how we know this, is the time that they're combining all of these different law books, is that there are three main, most influential scholars who are teaching law. And the law texts written by these three texts, we can now look at them. And if we look at these three texts, there's nothing, no agreement between them. The way they distinguish the castes just don't match. They're the three most influential, but they don't agree with each other. For an example, we have the Gautama, we have the Dharma Sutra by Gautama. So there's a sutra by Gautama. And so here, if the father is Kshatriya and the mother is Brahmin, so what do you consider the child? So the father is Kshatriya and the mother is Brahmana, what is it going to do? If the father is a Brahmana and the child is a Shudra, then what do they go? What are they going? When you're looking at, when you're counting out all these differences, then in the Gautama Sutras, this is what is explained in Gautama Sutra. But the other masters' explanations, there's no agreement among the explanations in the Gautama Dharma Sutra and the classifications given by the other scholars. And the reason why they cannot agree, because the explanations that they just explain them arbitrarily according to their own wishes, and they don't have any sources for any reasons or sources. And there's no factual basis for it, so they just wrote up what they had no choice but to write up what they thought, and they wrote their own explanations. So at that time, making this determination of the four castes and clarifying the castes, during the time that this is being conciled, the reason why this occurred is that at that time, there was a kingdom called Videha, and there was also the kingdom of Magadha. And these were the two most powerful kingdoms at that time. However, but the people of these areas were not 100% Aryan peoples. They had kind of mixed with the indigenous peoples of those areas, and so they're not 100% Aryan people. And even what some people say is that some people say that there were people who doubted that they actually were Aryan. What's even stranger than that is that here, as it's explained here, at that time, when describing the divisions into the four castes, they also included the ancient Greek people within the caste system. They knew that there were Greeks at that time. They knew a little bit about them, and when they learned about this, they thought those are the Greek people, so where do they fit? All humans have to be included in the four castes, so there's this Greek peoples. And so which category do we put them in? And this is a discussion that arose at the time. And so they put the Greeks in one of these four times, in the four castes. Now, at that time, there was no connection between Greece and Indian society, but they did know of the existence of Greece, and so they felt like they had to put it in the text, and they just forced it into one of the four categories. As a brief at that time, they talk about the four castes of Brahmas and Kshatriya, if they talk about this, you need to find someone who's a pure Brahmin, a pure Kshatriya, or pure Vaishya, or pure Shudra, because all of the castes had kind of mixed before, and so it's difficult to say that there's actually a pure caste. So from the beginning to the end, the entire caste system is just explained from beginning to end based upon their own whatever they made up. There's actually no authoritative source for any of it. And since they have no authoritative source, that the Brahmas at times really underwent a lot of difficulty. They worked hard in order to determine the system. They worked extremely hard to determine and finalize the caste system, and so there's no need to mention how hard they must have worked. So what later scholars say, or the modern scholars say, is that this is a time when the levels of education levels of people was not all that high. And because they weren't so high, and so to make it, and so if it's like, so it's like so they made up things. They used contradictory analogies, and so then, but no one seemed to suspect it. If there's no reason for it, but there wasn't even one who think there's no reason for it, so they think it's very strange. And not only did no one doubt it, everyone thought, oh, the four castes are like the nature things that was made from the gods, and believed it. And it's like incredible that people actually managed to believe this. Because if we think about it simply here, if we were to make up a caste system without, so basically the caste system we look at it, we say it's just made up arbitrarily, but people didn't question it at all at that time, and they believed it. It's very strange. It's like an inconceivable situation. Basically, actually, if there are all these if they had no actual authoritative sources for creating this system, there should have been someone at least who would like the later Buddhists who would actually question it. Even now in the 20th century, then in India, there are people who believe in the distinctions in the castes and who consider it to be very important. This is a really incredible situation. It's something, it's not understandable. Now, the Dharma Sutras also speak of the governance, taxation, and how to engage in trade, how to engage in farming, the military strategy, and so forth. And likewise, it also talks about criminal punishments and so forth, criminal law. It also talks about civil law. All of this is described in the Dharma Sutras. But what's strange about that is that people of that time really loved to memorize things. They'd memorize anything. And they would memorize everything. And so the text, they would memorize the text on philosophies, memorize the text on laws. But actually, at that time, there were paper and pens, but few actually ever used them. So what the judges would do, they would memorize the Dharma Sutras and then recite them from memory. And when they're deciding a case, there were no law texts because it's just this memory of that you had in your mind. And it's based on their memory. They made the decisions. And if they forgot something, or if they were mistaken, then that was it. Because they had no legal texts to look at. So just whatever remained in his brain, he could believe it and decide based on that, and then making that decision. If the judge didn't have such a good memory, there's the danger that they do very strange cases. But the Indian people at that time really loved to memorize. And I think actually that they're very stable memories. For example, when we were young, all this in older languages, we have a very, all the people of the older generation have very stable memories, right? When they talk about past events, they would talk about it as like they're reading from a diary and say, "Oh, this happened on this day and that day." And the people of our day don't have stable memories, and perhaps it's because we use our phones and computers and everything so much that we use them so much that we're not really giving enough training to our minds. In any case, at that time, the people of India really liked memorizing. Now, the second sutra is the Sutra for Householders. And the reason for talking about this is that there's an important point, which is so this is at the time. At that time, the people of India, now what it speaks about in the Sutra for Householders, that the people of the India of that time, it speaks about their daily life. Now, as I spoke about yesterday, it said that there are the four castes, there are three castes that were allowed to practice religion. These were the Brahmins, the Kshatriya, and the Vaishya. And so there were stages of behavior that they had to go through in their state of life. There's like a sequence in this life. So these four stages. So they're called stages or phases, and what they were called are the stage of celibacy, the stage of household life, the stage of forest life, and the stage of going forth. So these are the four stages, and these are important, I think. And we have the tradition in Buddhism of going forth and becoming monastic, and this existed in India before the Buddha appeared. And so I think that for today, if we speak about the four stages, then I think we can understand why there is we can understand the source for going forth in Buddhism. Now, the first is the stage of celibacy or brahmacharya. This is when you're a student. This is at a time when you're a student. So if you're a Brahmin, you study from the ages of 8 to 16. If you're a Kshatriya, then you study from the age of 11 to 21. Or if you're Vaishya, you study from the ages of 12 to 24. So the children of that age. So this is the Brahma, the stage is for the earlier for the Brahma, a little bit later for the Kshatriya, and a little bit later than that for the Vaishya. And when you reach that age, then you had to go and do your studies. And when you were studying, what you had to do is first you had to wear the Brahma's thread. The reason why you had to wear the Brahma's thread is like, the Brahmas wear this thread around them, and it's called the Brahma's thread. The reason why they wore the Brahma thread is that it shows that they are in a caste that has twice born. It's to show that they're members of the Brahmins, the Kshatriya, the Vaishya, and not a Shudra or an outcast. That's why they wore the Brahma's thread. That meant that they're going off to study. And once they've gone off to study, they would go to a teacher or a guru. They'd go to a guru to go study. When they'd go to study, they'd go to the guru, and the place where they stayed was in the guru's house. And the time when they'd study was dependent upon your nature. You could choose to study for 12 years, or 24 years, or 36 years, or 48 years, or so forth. You could study for as long as you liked. You could choose how long you wish to study. Now, the main topic of study was memorization of the Vedas. You had to memorize the Vedas. And while you were memorizing the Vedas, they had a very strict rules. For that time, there was a lot of smoke, This is not talking about smoking like we're talking about. This is we're talking about other smoke. You were not allowed to inhale smoke. You were not allowed to wear jewelry. You had to tie your hair on the top of your head in a bun. And your clothes had to be made out of hemp. You were not allowed to wear high quality clothing, nor were you allowed to follow your desires. And no matter what whatever the guru said, you had to be obedient and be very respectful. And every morning they would go to the surrounding villages and go asking for begging for alms. So there was the tradition of begging for alms at that time as well. And after they'd come back from the alms round, they'd have to give everything they'd received to the guru. And after the guru had his meal, then the students were allowed to eat their meal. The children were not allowed to eat until the guru had finished. Also, the students would go, had to fetch firewood or water, or sweep in the morning and attend the Brahma fire during the sacrifices. And in the evenings, they had to wash the guru's feet or prepare the guru's bed and so forth. And so it's only after the guru went to bed at night that the students were allowed to go to sleep. And while doing this, then the students had to study. And what they studied is, and they didn't study the same way students do today. Now, at that time, a student would stay in the presence of the gurus and become like a member of the guru's family, and then be the servant. So to be the servant for the guru. Yeah, and so they would work hard that way, and because of their efforts, they would receive some understanding of the ancient wisdom passed down from their ancestors, or so they believed. The students would study with either one guru or with many gurus, and when they'd completed their education, what they would do is the students would give a very large offering to their gurus. They'd give large offerings, and then they would return to their home. And so this is what we call the stage of stability, or the stage of studying, the time when they were students. This is the time when they were studying. Now, the second stage is the stage of household life. The stage of household life is the time that after you'd finished the stage of celibacy, then you'd return home. Once you'd returned home, then what you had to do is you had to get married. And once you'd gotten married, you had to become ready to continue the household traditions. Before you get married, you're a student, right? So once you've gotten married, then their lifestyle was very different. They had to live in a very different type of life. So during the stage of household life, this was considered the most important of the 4 stages of the life. And the reason for this is that most Indian people were householders. Since most people were living in the householders, this is considered a most important period. Now, during this period of living as a household, you had to do a lot of rituals. There are so many religious rituals, some that you had to do every day, some that you had to do every month, some that you had to do every year. There are many different rituals. There are innumerable rituals that they had to practice. And so that was the stage of household life. And now the next is the stage of forest living. The stage of forest life is, what do we say? Sometimes we hear about Indian masters going off on the conduct, particularly in the in the secret mantra, we hear about masters who'd go off onto the conduct. And I think that this probably means this, or it might mean the fourth stage. It means either one of these two, I believe. Now, what this stage of forest life means is that after staying in the house, you would leave that and then go stay in the forests. And once you've lived in the forests, mainly what you would do is there's nothing else to eat. So what you would eat is you eat tree roots and tree bark. And so they had a very meager lifestyle, very poor food. And so you had to subsist on this very meager food. But even during this time, you still did not stop doing rituals. You had to tend the Brahma fire and do prostrations in the morning and evening and so forth. There are many practices you had to do. The main purpose was to do practice, and in particular, to rest in meditation on the profound meaning. So the first phase is study. The second is living the household. And the third is what? It is this. It is the stage of practice, the time to actually do practice. Now, the fourth stage is called the period of going forth. Some people call it the time of the yogi, the samyasin, the stage of going forth, or the stage of yoga. And what this is you'd give up entirely, give up the house entirely. You'd shave your head and go forth. And you'd go forth, and other than your body, you'd give up all physical things other than your own body. And you'd undergo ascetic practices and give up food. You'd have one robe. You'd only one meal of arms per day. So you'd only have one robe to wear. And you'd only you'd live on alms and only going on begging for alms. And you could not stay in a single place. You had to go into all sorts of other countries. Yeah, you could not stay longer than one night night in a town. You had to stay in no fixed location. And so as you're going from one place to another, there weren't many rituals that you need to do. However, you always had to recite the Vedas and meditate on dhyana. And you would try to see the nature of the world, to separate yourself from the samsara of birth and death, or they would call the actual nature, the Brahman, right? And so you need to become one and chaste with the Brahmana. In brief, you basically need to achieve the happiness of liberation. So for these reasons, if this stage of this stage is also called a bhikshu. It can be called a yaga. It might be called a shramana or a spiritual practitioner. There are many different names for this, but I will explain them later. In any case, when you think about in our Buddhist traditions, the going forth, bhikshus and spiritual practitioners, these words come up all the time, right? And these are all existed prior to the appearance of the Buddha in India. And so there were stages that developed before, all of this developed before the Buddha. And if we understand this history, then we can begin to get an idea of why there had to be a tradition of going forth in Buddhism, and why there's a tradition of living in alms. In particular, the reason we think about the reasons for living on alms, the reason the scholars give for at that time is that in that area, the Aryan peoples had come down to the Ganges River Valley. It's a very, very fertile region, and the crops grew very well. So people had a very good life. And so people's life grew better and better. And because of this, they had a lot of excess food. And because they had so much excess food, when people came asking for alms, they had a lot of food to give these people. What this shows is that at that time in India, there was a very good the living was very good. And because the living was good, they had excess food to give to the alms. If you don't have any food yourself, then forget about giving food to people begging for alms. So the reason for the tradition of alms is because there was everything necessary to make alms. There was a good living. There was excess food. And so they had extra food that they could give. And so that's why the alms tradition developed. Now, this order of the 4 stages was not a unilateral thing where you had to first go through the phases of stability, then household, and then forest, then going forth. There were also people who first started their studies and then immediately went to the phase of going forth. Someone who had great renunciation, who wanted to free themselves from samsara, then they'd go immediately to the stage from the period of study to the stage of going forth. Now, generally, when we think about the going forth, there's people who had come to a certain age, and people who are coming old enough, the age of 60 or 70. And the reason for this is because they'd already given the responsibilities for their household activities to their elder children, and they didn't have a lot to do in their household anymore. And they said they're going to completely devote themselves to achieving liberation. And so most of these people were people in the 60s or 70s. So people took this lifestyle of going forth, mainly when they're in the 16th or 17th. Now, those who had the great wish for liberation went forth immediately after finishing their studies. In any case, what people of that time is that if you're someone who to go through all 4 stages of these stages, then you're someone who had completed all the stages of human life. And so there are many examples in history of people who went through all 4 stages in their lives. And so from ancient times, India has been a different country than others. They had their own education, to give their own advice and own methods. And their own practices. And so the people so it's basically only in India where these were all developed fully, not in any other country. So the people of ancient times worked very hard to go through the stage of the practice and to find all these stages of practice. And this is not pointless. It was very meaningful and extremely beneficial. And this determination of the 4 stages of the life also left a very strong imprint on the Indian civilization. It had a very strong influence. So next is this. So we talk about the development of ancient Indian areas of knowledge. The main cause the main condition for the ancient Indian areas of knowledge to develop is the development in religions. Now, the reason why this is that if you think, how did astrology come about? The area of knowledge of astrology, as I mentioned before, when you do rituals, you need to know exactly what data should be conducted upon. In order to know that, you need to examine the scars in the sky. So they developed the wish to look at the stars, and so for that reason, they developed astrology. When we talk about speeding reading or phonology, if you mispronounce things while reciting in the Vedas, then for that reason, they developed this reading or phonology. And so poetics and grammar. No, I've got this wrong. When you talk about grammar, grammar was studied in order to understand the meaning of the ancient literature accurately without any mistakes. That's why I studied grammars. Now, how did philosophy develop? Well, the texts on philosophy were in order to realize the sacredness of the God, or you could say just realize the suchness of the nature. And they thought about this a lot. And this is because they thought about this so much that they developed the texts on philosophy. Now, all of these different areas of knowledge are areas of knowledge that developed in India itself. It's not that they went to other countries and studied them. Likewise, there's also medicine in India. There's a practice of India in India. And the way that the practice of Indian medicine came about is that at that time, when they made sacrifices, they would make offerings of animals. And when we make the offering of the animal, then it's very specific. Because in some sacrifices, you need to offer the heart, you need to offer the liver or the heart or the legs. You had to make the different offerings of different body parts to the gods, and in order to do that, you needed to open up the carcass of the animal and look at it. They see that they understood from that is that and they understood how human and animals anatomy. Then they developed the medical knowledge. So it is said that medicine came from the blessings of the gods, and that people understand it. It is said this, however it was. I was mentioning the sutras before. When this genre of sutras appeared, Indian medicine had already reached a certain degree of development. Like there's also Indian mathematics. This is basically, it was developed in India and has its own particular Indian features. For example, we have the decimal system now, right? And if you count things in, we have like 10, 100, 1,000. We have 10, then after that you have 100, then after that you have, so after 1 you have 10, then after 10 you have 100, then 1,000, and so forth. This is a decimal system, and this decimal system also originated in India. There are also the Arabic numerals, the numbers that we use from 1 to 9. These numerals spread to Europe from the Arab lands, and so they're called Arabic numerals in Europe. They're called the Arabic numerals. However, but actually, their original origin is India. It is said. It is said. Likewise, we have 0, right? In Sanskrit, they call it shunya, or empty, because of this word shunya. They'd invented the idea of 0. This is the invention of 0. It was in India. Likewise, there's also geometry. It's basically measuring things by their shapes. And this is also an area of knowledge that was developed independently in India. The reason why they had to know geometry is that you had to make the mandalas for the rituals. And in order to make the mandalas, you had to know their size. What is the width? What is the total? What is the width? What is the height? And as you measure all that, they developed geometry. So basically, all of these areas of knowledge came from the religions, because of the existence of religion. But one thing that's really quite disappointing is that there are not many mathematical texts from ancient India, and so this is actually a rather disappointing thing. And next, I would like to speak about this. I would like to speak about the ancient Indian writing systems. As I said before, when in the early Vedic era, during the age of the Rig Veda, there was no writing in India. It was only later that they developed a writing system. And so for this reason, it's because they had writing that they developed the Sanskrit language. And because they had Sanskrit, then they were able to pass down the traditions of literature. Now, if you think about the writing systems or the scripts, the earliest Indian script is the Brahmi script. And here I will show you the Brahmi script. It's this. This is the Brahmi script. So now there was a writing system in the Indus Valley civilization, but we can't read this. So that was the earliest. So now these days, the Brahmi is the earliest Indian writing system. This probably appeared in the 6th century BC. Now, in the 3rd century BC, there was the Emperor Ashoka, and there are many edicts described on caves or in rocks by the Emperor Ashoka. Now, there are two different scripts that appeared. So now there are two ways to read it. Some are written from the right to the left, and some are written from the left to the right. So these two different types of writing systems. If you're reading from right to left was called Kharoshti, the Kharoshti Yige. These are read from right to left. So this is it. The Kharoshti Yige, Kharoshti script is this one. Now the one that's read from the left or right is the Brahmi, so that's similar. Later in the Common Area, around 400 AD, there were the Gupta letters. These are Gupta letters. This is the Gupta script. So these are the Gupta scripts that were used in the Gupta era. This basically took the Brahmi script as its basis and changed it a little bit. Around the 7th century, the Gupta script then all of a sudden disappeared. And the reason it ended is not known. So around the 8th century, the Gupta scripts were once again spread. And at that time, the script that developed that time was what we call the Nagari script. So this is the Nagari script. And so it turned into this Nagari script. As it comes in around the 13th century, the Nagari script was refined and reformed, improved, and what it's called then is called. They added a new prefix to it. They made a new script and they called it the Devanagari. And in order to praise the qualities of the Sanskrit language, they added, as a prefix to the word Nagari, they add the word Deva, or God. And so it's now called this Devanagari script. And so this is the Devanagari script is now the script used for Sanskrit and Indian languages is now this Devanagari script. So this is an explanation in terms of these scripts. Now, in terms of the languages, if you think about it in terms of there's this change in terms of script, there's that development, but in terms of language, there's nothing particular. The Aryan peoples were in the north, and then they gradually spread throughout India. And they came from the Indus Valley down to the Ganges Valley, and they spread in that area. And as they're spreading in that area, There are the colloquial languages. There are many different colloquial languages. They mixed with these. So they're mixing with all the different colloquial languages. And this is called the Prakrit, or this is called the natural languages. So this is basically means the colloquial language. Later, as they mixed as it mixed with all the different local languages, each language has different pronunciations, right? It's like in Tibetan, we have the Central Tibetan, the Kamba and Amdo dialects. We have all these different colloquial languages, right? Now, later, in order to standardize all these languages, the Brahmas took many of the grammatical points in the Vedas and Brahmanas and the Upanishads, and they made a new grammar. And the deciding the grammar was probably the time, but this was probably in about the 5th century BC. This is when there was the scholar named Yaska, and then in the 4th century there was Panini, the scholar, in the 4th century BC. So during that time, during their time, they settled the grammar of the Sanskrit language, and then it was accepted throughout Indian. And this became the pure and the very commonly accepted Sanskrit language. And so they were able to develop this language. If compared to colloquial languages, this is a more finely formed, or a language that many scholars had created as well as they could. So it's called the well-formed language, or Sanskrit. And so that is what is said. Now, the last thing I'd like to speak about today is this. Oh. It closed itself. What happened? And so the last topic I'd like to speak about today is this. As I spoke about the Vedas and the Brahmanas and the Sutras, and if we want to compare them, we don't need to speak about the time, but if we think about they each have their own unique styles. And so when the Vedas originally appeared in the Punjab, and their topic is primarily their worship of the natural environment seen as gods. And it's written primarily in verse. But the Vedas themselves came because of the blessing of the gods. They're like pure appearances from the gods, and then recited orally. Now, the Brahmanas, or when the Aryas had come down to the Ganges River Valley, and they wrote them at that time. And the style is written in prose. And the topic is primarily about the rituals, and in order to come to a greater understanding of the meaning of the rituals. And later also says that they also are said to have come from the blessings of the gods, due to which people had the Brahmana texts. And then later, the Aryan people gradually As the Aryan peoples gradually spread further through the Ganges Valley, the Brahmanas became common, and they're very long, and they're very difficult, and they're very long sentences, and so they wanted to make them just short and more concise, and so that is how the sutras came about. And so so now these are related with the philosophy and the grammar and the areas of knowledge. And so they become like textbooks so the sutras are basically textbooks, and that's the form they took. And the style they're written in was in verse. And so those that are in verse and that are very concise are what we call sutras. So in this way, the Vedas and the Brahmanas and the sutras, if we think about it in easy, or if we think about the difference, this is in a simple way, that's an easy way of explaining it. So I think that seems to be enough for today. This is where we need to leave it today. So tomorrow is a day off, and the day after tomorrow, we'll speak about the 6 softest schools. We need to have some sort of an introduction to them, because when we were studying them, when we were studying the great philosophical texts, we talk about these non-Buddhist schools. And so if you can have an introduction to them, I think it'll be beneficial. And after we've spoken about the 6 non-Buddhist schools, then we'll speak about the Buddhist era and the appearance of the Buddha and so forth. Actually, this year, I've extended the time, but the content, there's so much to speak about. And it's difficult to speak about everything that needs to be said in this year, but I'm not going to rush through it. In particular, when it's speaking about the topic of Buddhism and the origins of the Buddha, and the original and the development of the original teachings of Buddha, I'm not going to rush through it. I'm not going to go into so much detail, but I want to be able to give a good introduction to all of you. Even if we're not able to speak so much about the topic of mantra, and we won't rush through it and just continue. I'd like to just continue going, taking our time to go through it. So now we will recite the dedication prayers.